Welcome back to Spiritwind. And if you remember, Spiritwind is a study group for spiritual adventurers. And we have with us our leader slash teacher, Rick Reich. Welcome, Rick. Welcome back.
Thank you.
And we'll just do a little bit of a review of our subject matter for June, which was men's spirituality. And then we'll go into what our next class is going to be covering, which is ethics. So let's review a little bit about men's spirituality. We discussed quite a bit of the different archetypes of men, and you brought out a book about awakening men's spirituality.
Right.
So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, the book you're referring to is Matthew Fox's book, The Hidden Spirituality of Men. And most people know that there was the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, and later on the gay rights movement, but not as many are familiar with the men's movement that happened in the late 1970s and on to the early 90s. And it was kind of sparked off by author-poet named Robert Bly. And he's seen as kind of the father of the men's movement. Anyway, we explored different metaphors for men or archetypes. We looked at man as the hunter, the spiritual warrior, the husband, the father, the grandfather, Father Sky, and then what some of you would be less familiar with, the green man, and then lastly the prophet. So I was just going to take a few minutes to talk about the green man, and in doing that you'll see a little bit about what we were doing in the class. The green man was a sculpture of a face of a man that has leaves and all sorts of vegetation coming out of his mouth and nose and ears and all around his head. And the earliest examples of the green man go back to a tomb in France about the year 400. So they've been around a long time. But more than that, they're seen on many churches and chapels and abbeys and cathedrals in Europe and in England. In fact, at Chartres Cathedral in France, there's 72 representations of the green man on that cathedral. The green man appears to have been of pagan origin, some kind of fertility god of some kind, and the green man image relates to how, or metaphor relates to how men relate to nature. And when we look at the problems the earth is in at this time because of pollution and so forth, it's a time where men stand up and do the right thing, because their families and their children, their children's children are all going to live in the world that we leave behind for them. So that's an example of one of the things we looked at.
And was the green man then involved in hedonism or any of that type of thing?
No. In moving to this month, in ethics, hedonism was one form of ethics, and it was based on the idea of minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure. And a lot of times people that drink and party and do all that stuff are referred to as being hedonistic, but that's what it came from. Ethics itself is a branch of philosophy, and philosophy is just made up of two Greek words. It means philos, the philos part comes from philia, which means love, and the ology part comes from the Greek word logos, which means a word. And so it means the love of of wisdom, the love of wisdom. The end part, the osophy part, comes from Sophia, which means wisdom, the love of wisdom. And so it's a disciplined study where we think of ways of how we should live our lives as human beings. And as I said, hedonists said, well, the greatest ideal is to live in a way that you maximize pleasure in your life. The earliest codes we have of morals or ethics actually goes back to 2050 BC. It was the code of Namu, king of Ur. And then probably the most famous early code was Hammurabi's code, which was around 1754 BC. And it had influence on the Torah, I should say, part of the law of Israel. It has the famous statement in Hammurabi's code, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that same thing comes up in Exodus 21:24. So that brings us to the Jewish law. There was obviously, we think of the Ten Commandments, but Jews don't think of the Ten Commandments because the Ten Commandments, if you go on after the last law in chapter 20 of Exodus, it just continues more laws.
So there are quite a few more laws in the Torah.
In the whole Torah, which means the books of Moses, the first 5 books, there are literally 613 laws that the Jews recognize, 613 laws. And like that one right there, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's in Exodus 21. That's the chapter right after the Ten Commandments. So in the very next chapter, that's a law as well. And what's interesting is some of the Ten Commandments we find even in the 5 precepts of Buddhism. Buddhism, their 5 precepts are: do not kill, do not steal, do not lie, do not practice sexual immorality. And then the one that they have different from what we have is their 5th is to do not take intoxicants. Jesus, on the other hand, summarized the whole law, and he says that the whole law can be summarized by do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And the interesting thing is when we look at the world religions, there's an agreement on that. I just said what Christians say, do unto others. I'm going to just read some of the other world religions and what they say on the same issue. In Sikhism, it says, I am a stranger to no one, and no one is a stranger to me. Indeed, I am a friend to all. In Islam, it says, not one of you who truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. Buddhism is, treat not others in ways that yourself would find hurtful. Hinduism, this is a sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if it were done to you. And I could go on. It's the same thing as in Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Jainism, Taoism. So it's in all these different religions.
And so the ethical code then is based on that summary.
From a religious perspective, but we all can see that even though that's the goal, that's not what always happens. There's a lot of examples of people not doing unto others as they would have done to them, in the world. One of the most famous ethical ideas in the history of ethics was done by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, and he lived in Königsberg, Germany, and he died there as well. he studied at the University of Königsberg, and then he taught at the University of Königsberg until he died. He was there his whole life, never traveled more than 10 miles out of that town, and it was said of him that he was so disciplined that people could time, their watch by when he took his walk in the morning. Anyway, Kant felt, though he was a religious man himself, he felt that that ethics had to be based on pure reason. That it wasn't enough to say this is right because God said so in the Bible. He wanted to be able to show that it was right according to reason. And he came up with what is called the categorical imperative. And all that is, this is his definition, and then I'll explain it to you. But he says, act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Now, that sounds kind of convoluted, but what it's really saying is, before you do anything, ask yourself, would I want that to become a universal law?
Apply to everyone.
Right. Like if I feel like someone's making me mad and I want to hit him, do I want that to be a universal law that anyone that wants to hit anybody can hit anybody? No, we don't want that a universal law. And so Kant felt he had hit on the one reasonable argument that would prove ethics, without resorting to the Bible, Some other ones, there was a form of ethics called utilitarianism. And it was, utilitarianism was made popular by two philosophers, both English philosophers, Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832, and he was a political reformer who worked for the separation of church and state, equal rights for women, the right to divorce, the decriminalization of homosexual acts, and the abolition of slavery, the abolition of the death penalty, and animal rights. And this is back in the early 1800s. And his partner, John Stuart Mill, was also a British philosopher. He lived from 1806 to 1873, and he worked for freedom of speech, women's rights, and the abolition of slavery in America. Both Bentham and Mills taught what they called utilitarianism, and what utilitarianism taught was that what is best is what brings the most happiness to the most people.
I can see where individual rights may be stepped on in that category.
Exactly. Because if you're going, and in a way, that's how our government works. We take a vote, and the majority vote is the thing that goes, because that's apparently what is going to make the most people happy. But the problem is, it cuts minorities out of the whole process, because since they are not part of the majority, they're just left out.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that's a great form of ethics.
I guess they use that in war, though.
Oh, yeah.
Especially, how many
people
will it take
to take a certain position in a battle or something?
Because if we win, then the overall good is for all the people that are left.
The ends justify the means. If it'll make the most do the most good for the most people in the end. So, I'm not trying to make political statements, but if you were a utilitarian, you'd have to agree that dropping the bomb on
Hiroshima.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki was okay, because the end would justify the means, and that's the philosophy they used when they made that decision. Just two last ones. Joseph Fletcher was who lived from 1905 to 1991. Was an ordained Episcopal priest, and he taught Christian ethics at the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he wrote a book that really took off in like the 70s. It was titled Situation Ethics: The New Morality. And situation ethics, what he was teaching was that we can't just say, like Kant did, if a law's right, you do it, period. Whether you like to or not, because you don't want the bad part to become a universal law, And Fletcher said you can't do that because not every situation's the same. And the typical example they use is, for instance, according to Kant and the categorical imperative, since if you said lying was okay, you would be saying that it's okay for everybody to lie, and therefore you would live in a world where you wouldn't know what the truth was. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
According to Kant. So therefore you would never lie because you don't want it to become a universal law. On the other hand, what happens with Fletcher in situation ethics, say you are a German during the time of Nazi Germany, and you are hiding Jewish people, friends of yours, in the house. Maybe in the basement, maybe in the attic, who knows. And then the Gestapo come pounding on your door and they're looking for Jews. And they ask you, are you harboring any Jews? Do you say, oh yeah, they're in the attic right now, and tell the truth like Kant? Or do the loving thing according to the situation? And that's what Fletcher was saying.
So I guess there are a lot of situational ethics issues that come about, and one of them is the train on the two tracks theory, where if you go down this way, you're going to run over one person, but if you run down this way, you're going to run over 5 people.
Which are you going to do?
Which are you going to do?
Yeah.
And which one is right?
And again, that's a situational thing. What you're referring to, what they call a model in ethics, where they set up what's known as a thought problem. And the thought problem in this story is that there's a train and there's 5 people at the end of the train that are going to be hit. But if you were to switch the car onto this alternate track, there's one guy at the switch, and if you go that way, he'll hit him and kill him. If you go the other way, you'll kill the other 5. Which one would you do? Mm-hmm. To me, a lot of those models are very hard to deal with because it's like Nazis saying, okay, I'm going to kill your wife or your 2 kids. You choose. Mm-hmm. How can you choose when it's human life, Anyway, one last thing. I wanted to mention Dietrich Bonhoeffer, because he was one of these kind of people who did have to live according to situation ethics. He was a German Lutheran pastor in Nazi Germany, lived from 1905 to 1945. Among other books, he wrote a book called The Ethics. And ethics, he never did finish it, but it's a it's a good sized book where he was wrestling with questions about ethics. Now, he ended up having to not just write about it and think about it. He ended up having to do it.
Mm.
And how that happened was he was opposed to what Hitler was doing to the country. And he felt if Hitler was not stopped, there was no way to know where it would end. And so he became involved in an assassination attempt. And he, in 1943, they put a bomb under where Hitler was having a meeting and detonated it. Unfortunately, Hitler had gone to another part of the building at that time. He was caught along with the other people, put in a concentration camp, and was put to death just 2 weeks before the Allied forces liberated him. And he was just 39 years old.
So in all his ethics thought process, he felt that it was the most important thing to take out the evil person
Right.
for the good of a whole bunch
Right.
of people.
Which is utilitarian.
Right.
But in the circumstance, but it's also situation ethics, because in that situation, it seemed like the best, absolute best thing to do. But anyway.
Didn't quite work, right.
So that's what we're going to be looking at this month.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of these ethical questions are certainly on the mind of people today because of AI.
Mm-hmm.
And even the self-driving cars
Mm-hmm.
have had to be programmed into thinking, okay, I'm going down the street and the little boy with a ball runs out in front of me. What am I going to do?
Right.
Am I going to swerve? Am I going to brake real hard? Am I going to cause damage to the car and the people inside the car
Right.
to save the little boy out on the street?
Mm-hmm.
It's a hard job.
Well, yeah, it is. And AI, or artificial intelligence, we have that operating in a lot of different areas in our world now. One is self-driving cars, and there's in computers and all sorts of things, social media, all over the place. The problem is, I think, with AI when it comes to ethics, and it's kind of almost a weird thing, because you think of ethics as being a human thing. We don't think of ethics when we think of dogs. We don't think of ethics when we think of machines. And the reason why we don't is because ethics always involves choice.
Mm-hmm.
Either a good choice or a bad choice, and that's why we decide the ethics are either good or bad. It was unethical or it was ethical. So I think sometime, I don't think we're there yet, that we would, be condemning AI in actually thinking like a human being and making decisions like that.
I would think that as more and more programming happens,
I'm
that
sure
it's
it
going
will.
to have to get deeper and deeper and deeper
It will.
into ethics.
Yeah, it will.
And psychology and ethics, I think, are the main focal points that have to be addressed with AI at this point.
Yeah, those
And
two
it's
are-
hard enough for us to decide as humans.
Right.
And now we're going to expect a
That-
programmed unit
yeah.
to decide. Well, these are all of the things that we'll be able to discuss at our Spiritwind meetings in July.
Exactly.
And we have these Spiritwind meetings on Wednesday nights at 5:30 at Unity of Auburn. And it's downstairs. And everyone is invited. And there's no charge for this. People can come, bring their thoughts, read some of these books that Rick has given us that might be interesting for people. And come challenge some ethics here, people. It's a hard subject. We hope to see you there, and thank you again, and thank you, Rick.
Thank you.